This podcast is a project of the USAID Asia Counter-Trafficking in Persons Project, brought to you by the U.S. Agency for International Development.
The Chinese doctor who sounded the alarm on novel coronavirus has died from the disease.
Tens of thousands of people have become infected with the coronavirus, a respiratory illness that broke out in Wuhan, China in December.
Are these efforts enough? Or is the world witnessing the start of a global epidemic? This
I heard about
is
it
Inside
initially
Story.
actually from some family that I have actually in Australia, of all places, but they were talking about their families in back in Pakistan, India, where my family is originally from, hearing stories about these infections.
Mustafa Qadri is the founder and executive director of Equidem, which is a human and labor rights investigative organization. He's based in London.
But at that stage, like everyone else, I was fairly, okay, it looks like it might be another avian flu or something like that, but hopefully nothing too serious. That was around about mid to late January 2020. And, it's my nature. I'm an inherently optimistic person. So I was like, well, it's going to be fine. I'm sure it's a small thing. It'll blow over.
I'm Tara Kamal-Chavez, a Bangkok-based journalist and producer, and this is Labor of Loss, a series that puts human trafficking and labor exploitation in Asia under the microscope. From the notorious fishing industry in the open waters of Southeast Asia to the sprawling palm oil plantations in Malaysia. Millions of people are estimated to be trafficked in Asia each year, caught up in complex supply chains that reach across the globe and keep millions of others fed, clothed, and housed. Exploitation is deeply entrenched, but is change possible? And what does it look like? This episode, COVID-19 and construction workers in the Gulf states. What happens to the most vulnerable workers when the world is stopped by a global pandemic? We go back in time with Mustafa and his colleague Rameshwar and trace what happened as the disaster unfolded.
I'm declaring a public health emergency of international concern over the global outbreak of novel coronavirus.
Around February is when I started thinking, okay, this is something quite serious.
The main reason for this declaration is not because of what is happening in China, but because of what is happening in other countries.
So at the beginning, as perhaps other people also were in the same situation about kind of uncertainty, we were also not very much clear that what will happen.
Our greatest concern is the potential for the virus to spread to countries with weaker health systems and which are ill prepared to deal with it.
But when the country started to implement the lockdowns, that was the point where we kind of reached into the conclusion that definitely this pandemic will hit the migrant worker very hard.
That's Rameshwar Nepal. He's the South Asia director for Equidem, and he's based in Kathmandu. Equidem has staff in England, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. As well as team leaders, there's a network of field investigators, people who are migrant workers themselves who are on staff. They're the ones doing the researching on the ground in the communities that they're a part of. Equidem has a team meeting every week. In February 2020, Rameshwar reported back what he was hearing from his field investigators.
When the lockdown started to implement it, then the employer started to terminate the worker without prior notice, without paying properly, and the worker was so worried, and our field investigator brought this information to us saying that, look, this is very big problem, and like kind of a human cry, the worker's cry is going to happen very soon.
So it probably would have been around about that time in February when I remember speaking to Rameshwar that hearing from workers that were like in tears on the phone, talking about how they think they're going to die. They think that they won't be able to get buried back home in Nepal because they had the infection. Workers who were swiftly thrown into quarantine and they weren't heard about from anyone. My team was insistent that we have to go public with this information. We need to be telling the world what's happening. The staff felt very strongly that we have to speak out loudly, publicly, tell people what's happening. Because in fact, in many ways, people were suffering in complete silence. These are countries where there's no free media. These workers are living in these highly securitized accommodation camps, these labor camps. And so effectively you have thousands, if not millions of people that were in a form of imprisonment. I still remember, as if it was yesterday, that feeling of, wow, I'm in London, but this is real. This is actually happening. We've got to take this really seriously. And also that this is a humanitarian catastrophe.
Let's just take a step back here and get an idea of the migrant worker economy of the Gulf countries. We're talking about Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Oman, and Kuwait. Of course, they're different countries with different rules and regulations.
In Qatar, there's more space for independent labour activists to do their work, although there are still huge restrictions, and it's in fact in no way a place where you can act freely. In Saudi Arabia, for all the issues, it often has probably the best labour court system, although it's far from perfect. And in the United Arab Emirates, the labour ministry and the regulatory environment is probably the most developed, although it's highly privatised, which can be good and bad. Some of the countries like Oman, migrant workers can often bring their own families with them. And in fact, there's a degree of space there for migrant workers to settle in the country, even if in fact they're still second-class citizens in many ways. So, of course, we should not try to generalise so much that we forget that these are diverse, rich, dynamic societies with lots of complexity and contradictions in them. But what unites them is that if you are a low-wage worker, then you're facing discrimination, you have a higher risk of modern slavery and forced labour, and that these governments are not doing enough to make sure that you can just basically work and live with basic dignity. And we're talking about, tens of millions of migrant workers. In Saudi Arabia, it's one of the biggest migrant worker populations in the world. It's not just a handful of people here, it's a huge mass of humanity that's gone to these countries not because they're necessarily pleasant places to work, but because they want to have a better life for themselves and for their families. And they come from the most disenfranchised parts of the poorest countries in the world.
In the UAE and Qatar, 8 in every 10 people are not citizens. They're migrant workers. Overall, 10% of the world's migrant workers live in the Gulf states, and they live under a system known as Kafala.
Yeah, the Kafala system sort of comes from the word kafil, which means an Arabic sponsor. So, lots of countries have some kind of sponsorship system. It's not just in the Arabic countries. For example, in Malaysia, in the United Kingdom, where I'm based right now, in the United States, there are systems where to get a visa, you have to be sponsored by an employer. So in short, that's what the kafala is. But where it is a little bit unique or can cause lots of problems and open the gate to exploitation is that traditionally under kafala in the Gulf states, not only do you need to have an employer who is sponsoring you to get a visa, that employer is the one that controls when you can leave the country, when you can change jobs, is the one that arranges your ID so that you can get medical help, you can get registered to drive a car, you can get a place to live. They control basically every facet of your life.
They run your life.
They run your life. They absolutely run your life. And so what that means is that that person effectively owns you. And there's even been situations where relatively highly skilled workers, people on a very good salary, have actually been prevented from leaving the country because of their sponsor.
The music you're hearing comes from an experimental album and art project called This is Kafala, associated with an NGO called migrantrights.org. The artists put it together last year during the pandemic, and they were exploring themes about the kafala system and labor exploitation.
Now, what all these countries have tried to do, like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, they've tried to reform the system so that it's easier for workers to change their job, to leave the country, to not be restricted in this way. But the problem is that whilst there have been some really important reforms, they either aren't being fully implemented or they don't go far enough. Now, fully implemented means basically that on paper the law is there. In reality, in fact, workers are still being restricted in those ways. Or they don't go far enough, which means when you look at the fine print, in fact, the old system is still there.
Right. Is kafala very prevalent still?
it's hugely prevalent. So it's hugely prevalent across the Gulf countries. And, it's not just about the law, it's also a cultural thing. There's a real culture concept that, to be a bit blunt about it, people that look like you and I, if we go to the Gulf, that you are second-class citizens, that you are there to serve us, that your role is to make our lives better. And who are we to be listening to you? We're not equals. There's a real sense in the culture, and that has to be challenged. Just like in the civil rights movement or the apartheid struggle in South Africa, it's the same thing. It's not just about the law. It's not just about the politics. It's also a cultural tendency. So in that sense, Kafala, that mentality, Kafala is still very much alive and well.
That's the situation in the Gulf. So what about in the workers' home countries? This episode, we're focusing on workers from Nepal.
Nepal has a big problem of unemployment, I would say, because we have nearly 21 million population with the working age above 15. And out of that number of working age population, according to the government data, only 7.1 million are employed in Nepal, either in a formal sector or in informal sector. That means a large number of people who are unemployed. On the top of that, nearly 700,000 people lost the job during the pandemic. As a result of unemployment and very less possibility of getting employment within the country, a large number of Nepalis are compelled to choose the option to go abroad for the employment. And every day, more than 1,500 people leave the country formally. There are others who go abroad for the employment informally as well. If you add that number, annually there would be nearly 750,000 people leaving country every year for the employment.
Almost all of them go to just 6 Gulf countries and Malaysia. And of those people, more than 2/3 are low-skilled workers. Mostly they work in construction, but also in hospitality and the service sector. What kind of construction work do people do? Like, why are they needed there?
The type of work the Nepali migrant workers are doing is every sort of construction work, from constructing a building to road to the pipeline of the gas, and also the road construction, and also construction work related to the mega project, including FIFA Stadium, the World Cup Stadium in Qatar.
Why do these places in the Gulf need migrant workers to work in construction?
Because they have the mega project, they need hundreds of thousands of workers, but they don't have workforce in their country. So they are needing the migrant worker from other country, and the Nepali, for example, are also needing the employment. So this is because of the demand and the supply pull and push factor, definitely.
So now it's March 2020. Mustafa, Rameshwar, and their colleagues have realized that this COVID thing, it's serious, and it's going to hit migrant workers hard. They decided to start a major research project into what was going on.
The government of Qatar is closing more public spaces, including all beaches. Parks are already off limits, as well as restaurants, cafes, and shopping malls. The Gulf country has recorded almost 500 cases. It says most are expatriate workers.
It is now evident that coronavirus is more contagious than we could have imagined. It's spreading among...
I just want to take a moment to explain something, the situation of Equidem's field investigators, because it's quite unusual. As we heard earlier, these investigators are workers themselves. It's a network that Mustafa and Rameshwar built up over their many years researching on workers' rights.
The migrant workers who are low-paid workers, they are the one in most vulnerable situations. So to know the pain of that particular community, we thought that having someone from the same community will worth. So our field investigators are either the current migrant worker themselves or the former migrant worker.
So when the pandemic hit, we'd been already doing this kind of work for about 4 or 5 years at Equidem. So we were happy to be in a situation where we already had eyes and ears on the ground.
But it can be very risky for workers to speak out. After months of searching, we couldn't find someone who was in the Gulf during COVID and was able to face the risk of speaking with us for this episode, even among returned construction workers now back in Nepal. Can you talk about the risks that they face doing this?
Sure. So our staff in the Gulf are all migrant workers, and they face profound risks. Now, the most obvious one is the fact that the Gulf countries are autocracies. These are not democracies. Huge levels of surveillance, very strict criminal and national security laws in these countries. So you can be subjected to enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention, inhuman treatment in detention, even have the death penalty in some situations. And so our staff face the risk, if they're caught documenting what workers are facing, that they could be penalised by the government authorities. But even if government authorities are not involved, the employers could physically abuse them. They can have their visas revoked and be quite violently stuck in immigration detention and then sent back to their home country, which is traumatic, but also can mean loss of a livelihood. So there's a huge risk there.
But Equidem and its workers are prepared for these risks and know how to deal with them. As the pandemic spread, they realized that they were in a position that no one else was. They had a network of people that could tell a hidden story. So they planned their research. They developed an interview protocol and questionnaire. Then field investigators conducted interviews with more than 200 migrant workers, including people who were in isolation with COVID-19.
So we tried to, as much as we could, when we particularly heard very shocking cases, to verify those with other people. And so that's a big part of it. There was effectively a second round of interviews after that first round. And that was really important because we wanted to make sure that what we were documenting was really the facts. It wasn't just the worst case scenario. And what came really out of that was that, no, what we were actually finding was a very broad pattern that didn't just affect workers in, companies which did not have the capacity to help them, but even in relatively large companies, right? Even companies working on like the Qatar World Cup or the Dubai Expo, these two really big mega projects in the Gulf.
So what was this pattern?
The main problem is the non-payment and the pay cuts. And the second is the employer were unilaterally terminating their workers without prior information and arranging their payment or their flight tickets or their return. And even we found many employer not arranging the safety equipments and the materials, for example, the hand gloves and the mask and the sanitizers. And also some workers were staying in their own accommodation. So they were not having money to pay the rent, and the landlord kicked out them from the accommodation and they had to go and sleep in the park. In one hand, they didn't have work and they were not having money because some of them lost their job and others were not paid, and they were really wanted to come home, but there was no international flight operating.
Stranded with no income and no work, the pandemic pushes millions of migrant workers out of a job. They and their families back home go hungry. So who should look after them? And will the crisis change the way wealthy countries use foreign labour?
I remember that about 4 months down the track, when I was analysing the data with my team, realising that the real story here wasn't just the pandemic and how that as a health crisis was impacting workers, but that governments in particular had consciously decided to weaken labour protections so that it was easier for employers either to decide to keep workers on but pay them less and make it harder for them to leave a job, harder to complain about the situation, or alternatively fire the worker or not pay them because it was financially advantageous to that company. And that the way that the laws were written, that on its face it was clearly discriminatory, but they had a bit of a fig leaf provision about, oh yeah, but look after your workers. But we knew based on the interviews with workers that this was actually just a fiction, that there was no implementation of those provisions. And it was basically sending a signal to employers that, you know what, we know that you want to sort of try to restrict your costs during the pandemic and employees are a cost to you. So this is giving you a green light to go and just basically exploit these workers. Just fire them. Don't even notify them. Or, some of the laws in these countries would say, oh, you have to agree with the worker that they will not get paid and they'll be on unpaid leave. So they just forced their worker to sign a document that they didn't even know what they're signing. So what we discovered then was that governments and also employers were using this situation very cynically to actually cut off workers from the protection that they were owed by the state, by employers under international law and their local law. And that was, to me, the big scandal. It's like, oh, wow. Like, for a long time, you're sort of processing, and it's like, oh, God, this is so bad. This is a terrible human tragedy. But then you realize, oh, my God, there's actually some conscious thought being put into this to really, screw over workers. It's not just a consequence of the pandemic. A choice is being made to not help these people because they're disposable.
Equidem's research took 6 months. In late 2020, they released their report, The Cost of Contagion. Can you highlight the specific things that really stood out to you?
Yeah, so the key findings were that there were hundreds of thousands of workers, in our estimation, that were being subjected to modern slavery, not just because the pandemic had completely imploded the economy, which meant that jobs had disappeared, but that because governments and employers had decided to institute laws and policies that made it easier to fire workers, to not pay them, to restrict their movement, that effectively that placed people overnight in situations of modern slavery and forced labour. We found there was a huge gender component to this, that if you were a woman, you were particularly affected because, for example, there were these broad-based curfews in the evenings when they could whether they could move, leave their camp. There was huge restrictions on their access to medical services because there was this idea that, for example, that if women had to get access to medical care, even just for essential medical services, not just for pandemic stuff, that if there were no female staff at the health services, that they just physically were not permitted to travel there. At the same time, they didn't adequately gender sensitize their medical services. The other thing that we found was that the schemes that the governments and employers set up to protect employees was tantamount to racial discrimination on the face of the laws, but also the practices. And that led to, in fact, a two-tier system where workers, because of their nationality or the colour of their skin, were hugely discriminated against. And lastly, the other thing that we found out was that the absence of trade union participation, because it's illegal to join or form a union in the Gulf countries, practically all of them, that this actually really hampered the government and employers being able to respond to the situations that workers were facing. Because when you're facing hundreds or thousands of workers from one company or one project in the same situation, you can't deal with these cases one-on-one. You have to have some kind of worker representation. And while businesses and government were busy sitting at the same table, negotiating financial packages to support these businesses during the economic downturn because of the pandemic, or to provide a furlough scheme for nationals, or for wealthy migrant workers that we call expats euphemistically, workers did not have a seat at the table to be part of those negotiations. And so it actually led to a humanitarian crisis that could have been prevented.
Fast forward to mid-2021. Rameshwar says about 2 in 5 returned migrant workers in Nepal are now unemployed. The ones who are worse off are the people who had only recently started working. They hadn't earned enough money to recover what they had paid in recruitment fees, and then they had to borrow even more to pay for inflated tickets for a flight home.
The worker who were already in the difficult position, even who had to stay without money for a couple of months, they had to take another loan to buy the air ticket because their employer didn't provide the ticket. Neither the government, despite having their responsibility according to Foreign Employment Act to rescue the worker, they didn't rescue their worker. So the migrant worker ended up taking loan and paying the flight ticket. The interest rate of the loan in Nepal is very high, and when we interview the worker, the prospective migrant worker, the rate of the interest for the loan that they take is average interest rate is 36%. And we have interviewed worker taking loan in 60% annual interest. So that is too high. If you see the law of Nepal, it prevents taking interest more than 10%. But, the practice is different.
As we all know, COVID-19 is far from over, and so are the impacts on migrant workers. Equidem is hard at work on a follow-up report to the costs of contagion. Despite the grim findings of their research so far, Mustafa isn't dispirited. By the end of our conversation, he was still sounding energized by the prospect of solutions.
Our recommendations were, number one, if you're going to protect employee rights, protect everyone's employee rights. Don't have a better scheme for nationals or for wealthy expats than for non-nationals. And also allow workers to form and join a union, to have collective representation. That's a critical part of how you respond to the pandemic. And if you don't do that, you're effectively a toxic place to do the business. If you're any multinational working in the Gulf, even as we speak right now, if you're one of these large corporates that has been part of the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, which is excellent, well, you could be actually guilty of violating those principles, those values in your Gulf business, because the governments and the business community in the Gulf at the moment is inherently discriminatory and violative of gender rights and other labour protections. It was the first time in a long time, having worked on lots of human rights issues, where I felt like there's something that can be done about this. And, I'll say something as well, which sounds a bit corny, but I hope we speak in 30 years from now, because in 30 years from now, I'm convinced we'll see like a civil rights type struggle in the Gulf, where, in fact, suddenly these are societies where if you're not an Arab-speaking person, that there's a push for you to become a national, right? If you've got like a society where 90% of the population are not local born and they can't become a national, that's a form of apartheid, really. And I think that right now, because of their economic model, they can do that. But as the oil economy runs out, I don't think they can continue to do that. I'm not here to pretend that I can guarantee it's going to happen, but I do know you've got to have a long-term scale on these things, because that's how change happens. It's sort of, for me, it's a necessity. The change that we're asking for, it's ethically the right thing to do, but it's also a necessity.
I'm Tara Kamal-Navith, and this is Labor of Loss. Next episode, a different kind of deception. Women who end up in marriages in China are rescued and brought home. But what do they return to? Labor of Loss is a production of Winrock International as part of its USAID Asia CTIP program. It's hosted by me, Tara Kamal-Navith, and produced by Michael Green and Nicole Kirby. Sound design and mixing by John Chia. Additional production by Inigo Mentagon at Noise Studio in Bangkok. Additional music in this episode from the album This is Kafala, which you can find at tseflymiddleeast.org. That's TSE flymiddleeast.org. Thank you to executive producer Jeannie Crump, and to Sarah Piazzano and Natasha Burley, and to Julia from Liberty Shared. Thank you also to Deeptika Tapalia from Equidem. This podcast was made possible through the generous support of USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. The opinions are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of USAID or Winrock International.